Trump's own pick for Attorney General could soon pose a threat to the Trump presidency, believe it or not, because Bill Barr has stated it is a crime if a president orders someone to lie, like Trump is now accused of doing with Michael Cohen. So last year, Barr wrote this: if a president suborns perjury or induces a witness to change testimony, then he, like anyone else, commits the crime of obstruction. And he stood by that argument in his confirmation hearings just this past week.
You wrote on page 1 that a president persuading a person to commit perjury would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
You also said that a president or any person convincing a witness to change testimony would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
So if there was some reason to believe that the president tried to coach somebody not to testify or testify falsely, that could be obstruction of justice.
Yes, under that. Yeah, under an obstruction statute, yes.
So looking back at history for a moment, encouraging witnesses to lie was featured in both the Nixon and Clinton articles of impeachment. With me now is Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, a member of the Judiciary Committee. He joins us here on set. Senator, thank you very much for making the trip down for us from Connecticut. First, let me get your reaction to all of the news today and this bombshell report from BuzzFeed.
These revelations are deeply damaging, and this moment could be mortally threatening to this administration, not only because of Michael Cohen, but also because of the documents. And I used to say as a prosecutor when I made summations to the jury, documents don't lie. They can go after Michael Cohen, but remember, Michael Cohen, at the time he testified to Congress, was Donald Trump's personal lawyer, his fixer. So his saying to his lawyer or fixer, shade the truth, lie to Congress, as Bill Barr has said very emphatically, is a crime.
From your position on Capitol Hill, sir, have you received or seen any information that corroborates what we've heard today in that BuzzFeed reporting, that Michael Cohen was encouraged to lie? Do you have evidence to believe the president did instruct him to lie?
I have no evidence to support this specific report. And if true, is one of the sayings that's been repeated.
Right.
But what we see here is a pattern of the president's contempt for the rule of law. I've said, and this report confirms it, that there is a credible case of obstruction of justice against the United States president because of his false statements in the past to the American people, but also because of his really encouraging, deceptive statements about the Trump Towers meeting, about his concealing documents relating to his meetings in Helsinki. There is a pattern here.
We constantly hear from members of the House, and I know it's a different chamber, but we hear from them saying that they want to wait till the Mueller probe is complete before they proceed with a discussion about impeachment. I'm curious to get your thoughts. Does Congress have a more robust responsibility now, with this stuff coming out, with this information coming out, to do more sooner than simply wait for possibly another 3, 4, 5 months until a report is even possibly made public for them to act upon?
As a prosecutor, I always wanted all of my evidence before I decided what the charges were and before I tried the case. So waiting for the special prosecutor's report with all of that evidence makes a lot of sense. But the House should begin, and the Senate as well, right away with its critical fact-finding process through hearings, looking at the threat to our national security from the potential collusion ongoing, right now ongoing, with Russia, at the president's financial dealings, putting his own personal interest ahead of the national public interest. These kinds of hearings from the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee on the House side, but also on the Senate side, I think we need to have Donald Trump Jr. come back to our committee in the Senate and testify along with Michael Cohen. So there is a responsibility.
Okay, you brought up Donald Trump Jr., and he, in 2017, I believe, he said this about the Trump Tower meeting. I was peripherally aware of it, but most of my knowledge has been gained since as it related to hearing about it over the last few weeks. So if the BuzzFeed report is true, that could potentially be a lie. Do you believe that was a lie?
That's a very, very important question. I think there is enough evidence here of potential perjury from Donald Trump Jr. to call him back to our committee, to consider criminal charges against him, and to follow the evidence and the law as to investigating him. I think there is potentially an even stronger case to be made against him right now.
Criminal charges against Donald Trump Jr. if he lied. Is that correct?
If he lied, if he committed perjury before our committee, and I was in the room when he said to us, I was only peripherally aware. That statement, but also other statements. For example, his denying that he talked to the president about the Trump Tower meeting before or after it occurred. His saying that he was only peripherally aware about the Moscow Trump Tower project, but also his denial of talking to the president about it, his father. I think there is a lot here, a lot of smoke, and there may well be fire.
So you're saying all these points. Have you brought these up with your colleagues, the new chairman of the committee? Have you said to him, why have you not called Donald Trump Jr. in so we can get to the bottom of this?
I reiterated today my call, and I feel strongly that it's important to reiterate, to have Donald Trump Jr. come back. Today, I wrote to the chairman of our
Do you think he
committee.
will? Will he call Donald Trump Jr. back?
Well, we have to hear from Michael Cohen, too, and that's the point that I made to him. And I tend to doubt that Michael Cohen or Donald Trump Jr. may readily appear. We may need to issue subpoenas for them.
And finally, I just want to get your reaction to William Barr and his narrow definition of obstruction. How do you plan on voting on his confirmation? More importantly, what did you make of his definition about the obstruction of justice?
Two key points here. We've been talking about the Mueller report. I was deeply disappointed that William Barr said that he would not disclose that report to Congress or the public, that he would disclose only his version of it, redacting or changing it. And I will not vote for him unless he commits to make fully public the special counsel report to the Congress and the American people, at the very least, to explain why he has redacted or changed parts of it. Second point, William Barr, in response to my questions, said that he wasn't sure the president could be indicted. I think the president can be indicted if he has committed a crime. If he's suborned perjury or committed obstruction of justice, he is not above the law, and I think he can be indicted.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.